when you're ready.
Okay. So, how many of you have ever thought people that aren't you have had it harder than you? Show of hands. Maybe how many of you have ever thought people younger or older than you have had it easier than you? Okay, so once again, everyone has their hand raised. This could be because of the price of education. Maybe you thought that people nowadays have it a lot easier because of things like the FAFSA. Or maybe you think that people older than you had it a lot easier than you because of the cost of housing. There are millions of reasons why you could think that someone that is a different age than you could have had it easier. So that's what I spent my last year researching. What is the difference between the perception and reality of the economic difficulty experienced by generations at the peak earning point of their lives? So, in this presentation, I will begin by giving you a brief introduction and background of my topic, then moving on to introduce my methodology, then introducing you to my data, then showing you the conclusions I got from that data, and finally closing with the significance of my data. So, I began by researching the public discourse, or the literature found in public. And first off, I started with public opinion. And I think this quote from George Washington University grad and journalist pretty much sums it up, the public opinion of economic difficulty through each generation. From George Washington University, Generation Z is lazy, millennials are entitled, and the baby boomer generation are out of touch. Essentially, everyone perceives they have it worse. And then I moved on to research, where the results were equally as inconsistent. In 1 week, I read 5 different studies, all claiming that 5 different generations actually had it worse, which was really interesting because a lot of these researchers actually concluded using the exact same criteria for evaluation. So, what was different about these 5 different studies? Well, that's where my gap comes in. All of these different studies referenced different time periods in someone's life. And, well, they all didn't really cite why they picked those times. So, I chose to investigate the difficulty experienced by each generation at the peak earning point of someone's life versus picking a time period just in general and not citing a reason. So, what is the peak earning point of someone's life? Well, I defined it as off of the University of Chicago's Journal of Econometrics article claiming that the peak earning point of someone's life that completely will determine how much wealth they will accumulate over their entire life happens in between the age of 20 and the age of 30. And this has never been investigated before, and I am confident that it gives more accurate telling than just by picking a time in someone's life. So why is it important to research this? Well, first off, the government can make more informed policies to accommodate age groups who at large have had it worse. Next, it'll increase the empathy that people are having for other people in the world. Maybe it's telling someone that, hey, people who aren't your age may have actually had it worse than you. Or maybe it's validating someone's experience. And then finally, it's debunking those untrue assumptions that a lot of people have regarding, hey, maybe people who are older than you actually had it harder, and just because you didn't live that, you don't understand, and maybe you think that they actually had it easier because of, well, back in their day, they paid $3,000 for a house. But what's that adjusted to inflation? So, I'll begin by talking about, before my experiment, what I thought. So my initial hypothesis was that every single person is going to believe that their generation had it worse, just at large. And as someone who is a Generation Z, I also believed that Generation Z and millennials are going to have it worse. So I guess I backed my own hypothesis with that one. So let's move on to the methodology of my experiment. So I began by thinking of how I wanted to do this comparison. And I decided that I wanted to do a very different evaluation of perception and a very different evaluation of reality. So I began by evaluating perception, where I created a public survey. And this public survey was created through a focus group, which consisted of 10 individuals ranging from the age of 65 to the age of 14, where we worked to ensure the questions were clear on the survey, and we came up with a system called the scale system. In this scale system, we asked participants of the survey to rank each generation's difficulty they experienced on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the easiest and 5 being the hardest. We chose this simply because of how easy it would be to compare, instead of having to pick a number to assign them based on quantitative data that they gave me. Next, I evaluated reality. And I evaluated reality using 4 different factors. First, the U6 unemployment index, which differs from the traditional unemployment index that you're going to see on the news because it includes the traditional unemployment, which is the U4 unemployment index, but it also includes underutilized labor, which is people who would like to be working full-time but work part-time, and labor which has been and underutilized labor that has been given up, as in someone's looking for a job and they gave up looking because they just felt they wouldn't get one. The second factor that I used was the adjusted GDP per capita and the adjusted price of the home. Those two were kind of combined to create that score. And those both were adjusted for the cost of inflation so it would be more accurate. And then finally, I used the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, which simply says the average adjusted price of household incomes during the time when someone was in their peak earning point. And all those factors were evaluated at the peak earning point of someone's life. And then I also used a ranking system in this to make it easy to evaluate the difference between perception and reality. So essentially, the generation that had it the hardest in that specific category was given a 5, and the generation that had it the easiest was given a 1. So then let's talk about how I compared the two. So I began by independently identifying trends in the data collected from both separate research projects. And then I simply compared the trends. So let's talk about the data that I collected. So let's begin with the survey difficulty rankings. So what we're looking at here is the average economic difficulty score of each generation as perceived by Generation Z. So as you can see over here, you're going to be able to see that Generation Z actually ranked themselves on average having a difficulty score of 3.59, and that is followed by significantly lower scores for all other generations. You're going to see this trend continue through millennials, Generation X, the baby boomer generation, and the silent generation. Now, let's talk about the actual difficulty rankings. So beginning with the average unemployment rate of each generation at their peak earning point, we're going to see that by a slim margin, Generation X had it the hardest, and Generation Z actually had it the easiest. Next, we can see the adjusted GDP per capita of each generation at the peak earning point of their life, and we're going to see that on average, Generation Z at the peak earning point of their life had the easiest time because they had the highest average adjusted GDP, and the silent generation had the lowest average GDP per capita. And then we're going to see the adjusted purchasing price of a home, which also kind of accounts for the cost of rent or just the general cost of living. And we're going to see that Generation Z definitely had it the hardest by a very large margin in comparison to the silent generation, especially considering that these are adjusted for inflation. And then next, we're going to see the average consumer price index of each generation at the peak earning point in their life. And we're going to see that the consumer price index for the silent generation was the lowest, so they're going to be given a 1 for the easiest, and then Generation Z is going to be given a 5 for having the hardest. So what can we conclude from these results? So we're going to begin by concluding the perceptions of difficulty, where we're going to see that every single person exactly as hypothesized, or at large, believes that they have it worse. Next, we're going to see that on average, they all had pretty similar difficulty scores. If you think back to those graphs, you're going to see that on average, they had a pretty similar score of around a 3, which means that everyone perceived that on average, each generation struggled on average a score of 3 in their economic difficulty score. And then finally, we're going to see that at large, older generations were ranked having it harder. And then let's see the actual ranked difficulty. So, tied for first in having it the hardest, we're going to see Generation X and Millennials. Then we're going to see Generation Z having it the next hardest. And then at a tie for having it the easiest, we're going to see the baby boomer generation and the silent generation. And then if you'd like to see the graph of the actual scores, here it is. So let's compare. So my answer to the question of which generation, or the difference between the perception and reality of actual economic difficulty, is first off, is that there were pretty similar difficulty scores relating to perception and reality. The perception scores were all around 3, and so were the reality scores. So a lot of people perceive that every single generation has had a score of around 3 out of 5 for difficulty. Next, we're going to see that only older generations actually had it a lot easier than perceived, because perception scores rank at large older generations, the baby boomer and the silent generations, as having it the hardest, when in reality, they actually had it the easiest. Next, we're going to see that it's consistent that they all have small deviations between their difficulty scores. In the reality section, we saw a score differential of 2.5 to 3.5. and that's a pretty small number. And then we're going to see in the perception score, it's going to range from 2.75 to 3.75. That is a little bit larger of a number. However, it is 2.5 to 3.75. It is a little bit larger, but on average, the standard deviations between the difficulty scores were pretty similar, which means that in general, each generation has had pretty similar difficulties in growing their wealth. So, why does this matter? So, first off, policymakers can invest in systems that benefit Generation X and millennials, meaning that they can pass laws or legislation that benefits the cost of education or forgives student loan debt. Next, it's going to foster empathy. As I spoke on earlier, it's going to encourage people to understand that maybe they didn't have the hardest time, and maybe they can think of how other generations had it harder than them, or it's going to validate their experience. And then finally, it gives tangible evidence to underlying issues of inequality and forces people to address them. Because a lot of people can say that they perceive that this generation has struggled more. However, when you're given cold, hard data, it's forcing you to be accountable and say, how can we help these people who at large have been placed into a trap of poverty because they have it harder? And then finally, let's talk about the limitations of this study. So first off, the ranking system used that was assigned is based on order, and the differences between two averages could be very small or very large, and the different scores did not account for that. And then there were only a limited number of economic factors tested. Within the traditional public discourse where studies were conducted, on average they picked around 3 different factors to test to see economic difficulty. I picked 4, but obviously you could pick hundreds of different situations to test. I just stuck with what was the standard for this experiment and what many people were using. So I thank you so much for your time. I'm prepared for any questions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, some questions. How did your choices when you were designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
Yeah, totally. So I chose to find public opinion on the economic difficulty perceived using an online survey. And I also made the decision to include the silent generation and baby boomer generation, which, if you didn't know, they're all in their mid to late 90s, who are members of the silent generation, and the baby boomer generation are also getting up there in age, which basically means that on average, most of them are not familiar with an online survey, and my survey, when advertised using social media and just general outreach strategies, it didn't really get to them. So I had to actually go in person to present these surveys on paper or by reading them to these members of those generations. And I believe that this potentially limited my responses simply because in other generations I would receive over 50 responses, and in the silent generation I was only to get around 10 people who are from that generation. And I think it also gave me a lack of diversity of my responses, because my responses for other generations spanned across the US simply because of my research, my advertisement methods, versus I was only able to travel to only 3 different assisted living sites where I was able to interview people, and those were all obviously within Minnesota where I reside.
Okay, thank you. Some of these questions you answered. Can you talk more about real world implications or consequences related to your findings?
Yeah, totally. So I definitely spoke about this a little bit earlier, but I think my findings really highlight that in the US, not all people have had an equal opportunity. And as the US advertises that a lot just in their motto, it also kind of highlights and encourages people to find a new way of how we can fix things. It shows that entire age groups have been put down kind of systematically through the economy, and it really calls on society and government to pass legislation to counteract this. Especially, but beyond just calling on society to fix this, it also asks people to ask the question of why. It asks people to be like, hey, why does this generation have it so much harder? Is it the 2008 recession? Is it COVID-19? And why is Generation Z, which is the newest generation that is reaching adulthood, why are they seeing an upturn in economic ease? So it calls people to ask that question and do a lot more research into why and how they can fix it.
Okay. what was the most important research skill you developed as a result of this process, and how might you apply it to future endeavors?
Yeah, totally. So I would say initiative and self-advocacy, I'm going to lump those into one skill because they're very similar. And so I actually chose at the beginning of the year to do AP research as an independent study based on an assignment that I was given over the summer for my AP microeconomics course. We were to give a presentation simply about something about economics. And I did some research on the generations, and I was so intrigued by it that I actually wanted to do AP research. So this class didn't actually fit into my schedule, so I had to reach out to the teacher, and it told me that I had to self-study it basically for the first semester, which was a huge challenge, but I was really excited that I took that initiative. And then after a few months, I kind of realized that I didn't really understand exactly what I was doing. I was in over my head a little bit, so I had to learn how to take that initiative and advocate for myself. And I actually reached out to 50 different people to be an advisor for me. And I was turned down by 49 of those 50 people, which taught me a lot about, hey, sometimes I'm going to take that initiative, sometimes I'm going to fail. But I found an advisor, and he's a Forbes researcher and author, and he's a New York Times bestselling author for his research in economics. And it was very scary to work with him, but I learned so much, and I got so much more experience. And I know that it was really scary, but I ended up having a lot more opportunities because I learned that initiative, and I've used it in other ways, simply by reaching out to maybe a college advisor or something like that. And then additionally, it taught me that in life, in general, I'm gonna have to fight if I wanna do something. Things aren't gonna be handed to me on a silver platter if I wanna do something. I'm gonna have to self-study it. I'm gonna have to reach out for help. I'm gonna be turned down 49 times, maybe even more. But if I want it and I fight hard, it's gonna be worth it. And I learned to bet on myself and take that initiative to pursue what I want and advocate for myself when I need the help.
Cool.